It's way up here, isn't it? Ooh, we having hot church this morning. I want to express my sincere thanks and gratitude to Reverend Boswell for inviting me to be your preacher this morning. I'm humbled and grateful to grace this sacred space. Many of us are gathered here today to show support for Wear Orange, Gun Violence Awareness Sunday. You see, orange is the color that Hydea Pendleton's friends wore in her honor when she was shot and killed in Chicago at the tender age of 15. Just 1 week after performing at President Obama's second inaugural parade in 2013. After her death, Hydea's friends and family asked all of us across the nation to speak out and to wear orange to raise awareness about gun violence. Since then, orange has been the color defining gun violence, the gun violence prevention movement. I could give you statistics, but one thing I need you to know, that 120 people are shot and killed every day, and hundreds more are wounded every day in this country. Together, this morning, we call for meaningful action that's gonna save lives. We are not going to live in fear that gunfire can ring out at any moment. We all know about Uvalde, Texas, and the Buffalo shooting, and New York and Pulse, and I could go on and on and on about the kind of mass shooting gun violence that continues to occur in our country. Today's sermon was inspired from the passage that was read in your hearing from the Old Testament book of Esther. And it just so happens to be the main title of my book that was released in June of 2019. I don't know if you know the story of Esther, but I encourage each one of you to go back and read that small book in the Old Testament. Learn about the backstory of this courageous, smart, young Jewish girl. So today, I'm asking you to use your holy imagination as I try to tell some of this story. Mordecai, who was said to be Esther's adoptive father, her guardian, mentor, confidant, and fellow leader, advocating for the rights of their Jewish community. The life of Mordecai might seem secondary in the extraordinary story of Esther in the Bible, but Mordecai was just more than her uncle who welcomed her as his own daughter. You see, Mordecai was important in the community, who refused to bow down and pay homage to Haman, a high official of the king. Haman becomes angered and plots to destroy all the Jews in the kingdom. Mordecai hears about this. Somebody came back and told him what Haman was about to do. And Mordecai went to Esther, telling her those famous lines, "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish." You see, once Esther was in the palace, because you see now she's Queen Esther. Her life was governed by elaborate rules and regulations. She had a clearly defined role, and she knew that she would be in big trouble with the king if she stepped out of line. Amen? Esther is in a predicament. First, if she supported Mordecai, she would have to reveal her heritage as a Jew. Now, Esther didn't tell anybody she was a Jew. She knew if she revealed her heritage that she would never be picked to be in the palace. Secondly, the king had not called for her in 30 days because you see, during this time, to enter the king's presence without an invitation risked her being killed. Yet Mordecai, who raised Esther, challenged her. When her people, the Jews, were facing grave danger, Mordecai wanted her to take a tremendous risk in order to save them all. Can you imagine the kind of pressure Esther faced? The fate of all her people lied in her hands. I can imagine Esther being afraid and confused, just like I was on June 17th, almost 8 years ago, when my mother, Mrs. Ethel Lance, and my cousins and childhood friend and 5 others were killed in Emmanuel AME Church. A then 21-year-old white supremacist walked into that church to kill as many people as he could. He walked in that church with a twisted heart filled with hate. This young man sat through an hour of hearing the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, the parable of the sower. He sat there. I was told for 1 second, fleeting moments, he felt like he was not going to do it. But in the same fleeting moments, that hate came into his heart and he did what he set out to do. There were 5 survivors out of that massacre, and these people have to live with the trauma of being in that church that night and surviving. I believe their deaths, the deaths of the Emmanuel 9, was a catalyst for this country to recognize that hate crimes and racism was on the rise and that white supremacy was coming more and more public. White ideologists were crawling from under the rocks that they live under. My mother and my cousins were killed because they were black people. But since 2015, there has been more than 10 mass shootings labeled hate crimes. You see, this new ministry God has called me into is a result of the most painful, grief-stricken time in my life. Myself and those 8 other families and my family, we became members of a club that nobody wants to be a part of. The dues to be in this club is to be deemed as a survivor of gun violence. I beg each and every one of you never have to be a part of this club. You see, I will forever advocate for change in their names because we must not forget why they were killed. I honor them because, again, I believe that God used their deaths for a higher purpose. I believe God knew that they would be the one to get this nation focused on what we need to do, not just for black people, but for all people. God was calling them to a purpose we as humans, we can't comprehend. Even as a Jesus follower, I couldn't understand in those first days. I struggled with God, trying to understand, asking over and over, why, Lord, why them? And in my reading and searching, God led me to the book of Esther. Esther was chosen. Mordecai was chosen. My family and those other families, you see, they weren't in the wrong place. They were in the right place at the right time. I finally understood what God needed me to see. God had a bigger use for them. For such a time as this, what does this phrase really mean? When we look at the life of Esther, this phrase actually refers to Esther being earlier in the book of Mordecai warning Esther of not being self-indulgent and self-persevering. As in the beginning of the story, Mordecai blasted Esther for living large and embracing royalty over righteousness, selfies over service, amen? And he had to remind her that she had been chosen to set her own interests aside, let go of her own ambitions, and face an enemy full on. She was to risk her life and her legacy with no guarantee of a positive outcome. I believe that we people who are Jesus followers, we are called to set aside our own selfish needs for the greater good of the whole. In Corinthians chapter 12, it tells us if one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. For such a time as this, June 4th, 2023. Again, we know that this weekend, this country is remembering, advocating for gun violence reform. Moms Demand Action in every town is the groups that picked me up when I didn't know what my life was going to be like, who gave me the confidence to say that I have something to say about this because I have witnessed this firsthand. You too could be a part of this. And Moms Demand, I love them with all my heart, but there are many different groups out there. Giffords and Sandy Hook and all of these other groups that are advocating for common sense gun laws. We need to remind people again and again how common sense gun laws can save lives. Just in the past week or two, we remembered Uvalde. We remembered Buffalo for the first year that they have had to deal with such tragedy in their lives. Church, we are faced with the public health crisis, not only across this country, but right here in our own backyard in the city of Charlotte. There have been 2,359 victims of firearm-related violent crime here in Charlotte. I'm not talking about Chicago or New York or wherever. Right here in our own city. And we already know that black and brown people are disproportionately more affected and killed than any other group there is. I don't know about you this morning, but we have to step up and we have to do something to help save lives. We have to step up and put ourselves out there like Esther and Mordecai had to do. We need so much to be done from the inside of the church, and then we need to take it on the outside of the church. We have to be people who are courageous enough to take a risk and do more than we've ever done before in our lives. As the young folks say, we have to be about it. We have to be about it. We can't sit there and talk. We have to be about it. Do something you've never done before. You could phone bank from the comfort of your home with your iPhone. You could write cards and letters. You could call your legislatures. There is so much that you could do. There is something each and every one of us could do to make our lives. I have 2 young grandbabies now, 2 little boys. I have a black son. Every day when I open my eyes, I pray to God that you will protect these babies of mine. And that's why I won't ever shut up about gun violence and what it does to all of us, because this is personal. This is personal to me. God created each and every one of us for such a time as this, to be a witness and to share a testimony of how God has kept you, and now you're willing to help keep someone else. Church, we have a lot of work to do. When I asked God what to do, God said, it's time. It's time, sisters and brothers, it's time to get to work. It's time to put our feet on the ground. Mordecai's question to Esther carried with it a call and a challenge. Esther was asked to play an important role in God's plan for the Jewish people. She had been put in that place at that time because God had a job for her to do. We all have a job to do. God is calling you for such a time as this. Amen and amen.